Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. The stereo is already on. A blank cassette is sitting inside the tape deck, and a teenager is hovering over the record button, waiting for exactly the right moment. Because this is the only way to capture a favorite song without having to pay for it. If you hit it too early, you waste half the tape waiting your way through commercials and chatter. If you hit it too late, you miss the beginning of the song. And in the middle of all that timing is the voice coming out of the radio. A man by the name of Kasem. He's counting down the biggest songs in the country, teasing the next one just enough that listeners never quite predict when the music will actually start. The teenager leans closer to the stereo. This has to be the one. The clue sounded right, the hint sounded familiar. The song they've been waiting all week to record should be coming up next. A finger presses down on the record button, and just like that, it happens again. Either the first few seconds of the song are missing, or Casey's voice ends up recorded right over the intro.
Hello again, and welcome to American Top 40. My name's Kasem, and I'm ready to count down the most popular songs in the nation.
But what the teenager doesn't realize is that the exact same voice is coming out of radios all across the country at the very same moment. Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles. The show sounds local, but it isn't. Remember, this is before satellite. The show was recorded earlier in the week and pressed onto vinyl records, and those were shipped across the country and carefully scheduled so stations in different time zones could all broadcast the same countdown. So how did one voice end up inside radios all across America? Who figured out how to turn a radio personality into a national product? And where did the story of that voice begin on April 22nd, 1932? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, April 27th, that story takes us to 1932, the voice that scaled radio. When radio first became a dominant form of entertainment in the United States, it was deeply local. Every station had its own personalities, its own DJs, and its own way of doing things. The music played in Detroit might be different from what listeners heard in Los Angeles, and a countdown of popular songs in one city might not match what another station believed was climbing the charts. That local identity was part of radio's charm. Listeners felt like their favorite DJs belonged to their community. Into that world stepped a young man from Detroit named Kasem. Kasem didn't begin as a national celebrity. Like many radio personalities at the time, he worked his way through smaller stations, developing a style that mixed enthusiasm for music with something slightly different: storytelling. Instead of simply announcing songs, he connected them with anecdotes about artists or chart movements and the listeners who had requested them. Meanwhile, two radio producers, Don Bustany and Tom Rounds, were thinking about a larger opportunity. They believed radio might be ready for something that sounded familiar but worked very differently behind the scenes. Instead of every station building its own countdown show, what if one polished program could be produced in a studio and then distributed across the country? Believe it or not, that idea seemed unusual at the time. Radio was supposed to feel local. But both of them believed a national countdown could actually feel more authentic as long as the music ratings came from a trusted source like Billboard magazine, and the host had a voice listeners trusted. For that voice, they turned to Kasem. And in 1970, they launched a show called American Top 40.
Hello again, and welcome to American Top 40. My name's Kasem, and I'm all set to count down the most popular songs in the USA. These are the records you're buying and radio stations are playing all over America. And how do I know? Because Billboard magazine says so.
But here's the thing. Launching a national radio show in 1970 required solving problems that modern audiences rarely think about. As I mentioned, there were no digital downloads, no satellites feeding programs across the country in real time. Instead, the producers of American Top 40 recorded the program in a studio and then pressed the finished product in the beginning onto a set of vinyl records. Later, they would move to reel-to-reel tape, but in the beginning, they were spinning platters. Each week, those records were packaged and shipped to radio stations across the United States. When the boxes arrived, station engineers would place the disc on turntables and play the program during their weekend schedule. Cue tones embedded into the recording signaled when local stations could insert commercials or station identification, allowing the national program to blend into each station's broadcast. Time zones added another layer of complexity. Stations in New York might air the countdown hours before stations in California, and some markets chose Saturday night, while others scheduled the program on Sunday. Even when the broadcast was technically recorded days earlier, the show still felt immediate to listeners, waiting for the reveal of the week's biggest songs. And what held that entire system together was the voice guiding the countdown. Kasem delivered the rankings with an energy that made listeners feel like they were sharing a moment together, even though the same recording was being played in hundreds of cities at different times. The combinations of music, storytelling, and anticipation turned the show into a weekly ritual. For listeners, it sounded like a familiar radio program. For the business of broadcasting, it was something new. One host, one show, distributed nationwide.
American Top 40.
As the 1970s moved forward, American Top 40 spread rapidly across the country. More and more stations began carrying the show, partly because it delivered something difficult for local stations to produce on their own. The program had national credibility through the Billboard charts, a polished production style, and a host that could guide listeners through the music with warmth and storytelling. For many listeners, the show became a weekly ritual. Teenagers waited by their radios to hear their favorite songs and where they had landed on the charts. Some hovered over cassette recording buttons, hoping to capture a song at just the right moment. And for a generation of listeners, the sound of Kasem's voice became part of those memories. Behind the scenes, the program demonstrated something important for the business of broadcasting. A single personality could now anchor a program that was distributed across hundreds of stations nationwide. That model quickly spread through the industry. Syndicated talk shows, national entertainment programs, and later television and podcast personalities all built on the same structure. Other hosts eventually stepped into similar roles. Some even took over versions of the countdown itself. But for many listeners, the experience never quite felt the same. Kasem's voice had become tied to a particular moment in radio history, and that kind of connection is difficult to recreate. Unfortunately, Casey's own story would eventually include difficult chapters later in his life, filled with family disputes and headlines that contrasted sharply with the warm voice listeners remembered from the radio. That part of the story is complicated enough that it deserves its own episode someday here on Business History. But the voice that once counted down songs across hundreds of stations had started much earlier, when he was born on April 27, 1932. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.